Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
So I think to be a researcher, it's very important to feel like, or it's ideal to feel like what you're doing is the most important thing in the world. And I feel like what I'm going to talk about, I apologize to everyone else because this is, as I said, it's important to feel that way for ourselves. And I hope other people feel that way about their research as well. But I really feel like what I'm going to talk about is the key to anthroposophy. I'm going to talk about the geometry of the infinite and invisible. So some of you may be wondering why there's a geometry talk at a conference about Rudolf Steiner. However, Steiner himself singled out his encounter with geometry as one of the most important steps in his spiritual development. Geometry states eternal truths behind visible forms, while, on the other hand, the visible world seems, by nature, to be in a constant state of flux. This conquest of the impermanent is what has made geometry the highest role model of knowledge and science, spiritual and otherwise. And in today's over-specialized world, very few have received the news that these eternal truths only find unity and coherence by completing the world of finite and visible forms with the infinite and invisible. Now, in contrast to most modern experts in mathematics, Rudolf Steiner saw a metaphysical truth in this complete system of geometry. So this complete system of geometry is not in any way this geometry of the infinite and invisible. It's not in any way a matter of controversy in the mainstream of mathematics. They call it by a much less mind-expanding name. They call it geometry over complex projective spaces. But what it really is the geometry of the infinite and the invisible. But Rudolf Steiner, in contrast to the maybe intellectual mainstream of mathematicians, saw a metaphysical truth in this complete system of geometry. And the most famous meditation he gave on the geometry of the invisible concerns a metamorphosis. And I, together with a distinguished eurythmist who we have here, are now going to demonstrate this metamorphosis through a eurythmia exercise given by Rudolf Steiner to invigorate the life forces of children. So thank you very much to Jan Rank, and if she comes to your town to give a eurythmy course, I highly recommend attending. So I don't know how well the camera captured that for the online audience, but I have the forms on the next slide, although I don't actually know how to get to the next slide. Is it? Oh. Yeah, I'm trying those. They're not doing anything. Oh, use the mouse. Where?
Right.
To the right?
Yeah, down. Up. Yeah. You can use that as well.
Okay. Oh, okay. I don't know how I'm going to get back up when I need to. Okay, it's fine. Okay. Yeah, these arrows don't work. Side, up, down, none of it works. Oh crap! I get. Oh, okay. Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you. Okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties here. Yeah. So, what these forms are called is the Cassini curves, and it's or the Cassini family of curves. It's a metamorphosis, and you can see the first one on the left is an oval shape, and then the second one, it begins to become indented and look kind of like a peanut, and then it becomes so indented that the central piece in the middle moves in, and also something qualitatively changes. It becomes a this lemniscatory movement that crosses itself, And then in the final one, it appears to be two separate ovals. Now, Rudolf Steiner spoke about this metamorphosis. He said that mathematics itself provides us with facts which oblige us to go out of space if we would preserve the continuity of the idea. And he also spoke about how, so going out of space. So what does that mean to say that this curve is not actually divided, but is still connected? And so that's what he's insinuating, is that this curve is actually still connected, that at any point in the metamorphosis, it's connected and it's still connected over here. Now, how could we maybe, how could we formulate this idea? So this is not an accident. This line is intentionally right through the middle here. And this line is intentionally there. Now, if we go through this metamorphic process, it's clear that the line crosses this curve in two places, right? Continues to cross the curve in two places. And then these two places overlap, but it still crosses in two places. And then here you'd say, oh, well, it doesn't cross anymore. It divides them rather than crossing them. But actually, according to, from a certain form of mathematics, as I mentioned, this curve does actually still cross this line in two places. Those two places are just invisible. So that's a weird idea. So, but to experienced meditators and eurythmists, this can become a concrete experience, or even children who are doing eurythmy, perhaps, this can become a concrete experience. Now, to others, it might invite the question of why? Why would we think such strange thoughts? Why would we say that these are connected? And now, how do I get back to my slideshow? Bottom taskbar, Adobe. Thank you. Okay, so why the invisible? Now, the history of mathematics, to answer this question, from a historical perspective, the history of mathematics leads us to a prisoner of war in Napoleon's army in a labor camp in the vast expanses of Russia. His name was Jean-Victor Poncelet, and he wanted to keep his mind active during this hardship by reviewing the fundamentals of geometry from scratch and building up in his mind, building up everything he had learned in geometry from scratch. Now, seemingly unfortunately, he couldn't remember everything. There were some gaps in his memory, and he was being marched around doing forced labor. It was not an easy time, and there were some pieces missing that he couldn't remember. But in order to, only 4 minutes left? 5? Holy crap. Okay, so. Okay, thank you. So I don't even know what I can say. Anyways, I guess I'll go really fast. But in doing so, there were pieces he couldn't remember, leading him to postulate what is called the continuity principle, which is allowed him to derive everything that he knew from geometry, plus some surprising things that he had not previously known from geometry that he discovered. And in particular, this led to this concept of the invisible that Rudolf Steiner alluded to. Now, what the invisible does is it gives coherence to the visible. And let me explain what I mean by that. So in this picture, we have 3 circles, and each of these, the blue circle and the red circle, I've connected the intersection points by a purple line. So we take the intersection points of any pair of these circles and we connect them. And these connecting lines, they all come together in a point. And no matter how you move the circles around, they still come together in a point. And these lines, so each of these lines, these circles are the same size, and each of these lines is the halfway line between the centers of the 2 circles. And On the other hand, you can pull the circle out, so it seems that they don't overlap, and yet their center lines still come together. So this could seem like a little bit of a trick because these are equal radius circles, but there's actually a ratio. There's still a ratio, a more complicated ratio, if these circles have different sizes, different radii, where the intersection points, they still come together. You can calculate the ratio, they still come together, and they still come together when they don't visibly appear to overlap. Okay. So infinite, I'm just going to skip the infinite, I'm sorry. There's something, except there's one thing at the infinite, which is called the circling points at infinity. I'm going to skip right to that, which is how it's a way that a space becomes something of a quality. So I'll just briefly talk about the infinite, that in projective geometry, parallel lines meet. And so the quality of parallelism becomes an infinite location, a location that's infinitely far away. And so the intersection of two lines that, from a finite and visible standpoint, you would say that two lines don't intersect, but there's an infinite place where they do intersect, and that's endows the quality of parallelism. Now, it turns out the same thing is true of a circle. You have two circles that appear not to overlap, and actually they do overlap, and actually all circles simultaneously overlap. There's something that's simultaneously inside of all circles at the same time, and it's both infinite and invisible. I wish I could say more about why, but it's called the circling points at infinity. Really good stuff. And then the invisible and the living, there's this work of Lawrence Edwards. He talks about another family of curves. Families of curves are a great way of studying metamorphosis. He talks about another family of curves called path curves for certain reasons, but these curves concentrate in these families of curves. They concentrate in three different points, which are the vertices of this triangle. Now, if you make two of these points, the circling points at infinity, all of these curves that are bunching up at these points become spirals that spin out. They spin out to infinity. And so they have invisible fixed points. They concentrate at two invisible fixed points, as well as the third fixed point, which is the eye of the spirals. And so a question of research that I've been carrying that I would really like to look more into and do some serious studies on is if we can learn to directly perceive the subtler manifestations of the invisible. Because the circling points, they're 2 points, they're kind of like the sun and moon of the invisible. They're very conspicuous. The quality of roundness is very conspicuous. Everyone can see roundness. But the subtler qualities are what's very interesting. And I wanted to say about Edwards's research, Lawrence Edwards's research, these path curves. So they have a three-dimensional analog, and he was able to use some of them to give uncannily accurate archetypal models of several living shapes in nature, for example, pine cones and flower buds and eggs, uncannily accurate. All of those have a certain roundness to them. And in three-dimensional space, there's 4 fixed points. There'll be the two extremities of, say, the egg, the sharper end and the flatter end, same with the rosebud, But then the other two are the circling points. Now, however, there was also one form that he looked into that had invisible fixed points, which were not the circling points, and that is a ventricle of the heart, which is very interesting. So you look at a ventricle, and unfortunately, I can't pull the link, I don't have time. But if you look at a ventricle of the heart, it doesn't have any obvious roundness to it, but it's yet a very important organic living form. So this is very interesting that this subtler manifestation of the invisible, kind of like some stars or planets, not like the sun and moon, something a little bit less obvious, also has a manifestation within the organic and the living. Very interesting. And then, so this area of research that I would like to look more into is if we can develop direct perception of the forming capacity of the invisible in subtler manifestations. So for instance, I think most of us, if we just saw a heart ventricle versus some random blob, would we be able to tell which one came from organic nature and which one was just a random thing? I don't know. But so for instance, in this image, if we look at these two images here, this one is obviously more harmonious, I would say, right? This one's sort of chaotic and this one's a bit more harmonious. Now, what's happening visibly over here happens invisibly over here. Now, I'm interested, maybe a show of hands as to which of these two images people find more harmonious. I think we can all agree this is more harmonious than this, but if we just look at the two on the right, can I get a show maybe I'll pause a second and then ask for a show of hands for who thinks it's the right image and then who thinks it's the left image. Left, 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 left. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I heard left, almost unanimous left, which is really amazing. Yeah, it's very interesting. I've shown this. I live in Dornoch. I'm mostly around anthroposophists and people who are spiritually sensitive in some way or open-minded. I ask this question about harmonious, and people usually go to the left. I've had one exception of all the people I've asked, a very good friend of mine who's a materialist, and I asked him, and he said, "What does harmonious mean?" And he chose the one on the right. Okay, so that I think is a very interesting area of research. And then I also think if we go further from kind of the exact metaphysical things we can pinpoint, I've been kind of trying to talk about what we could pinpoint metaphysically, but I think there's also a rich source of analogical value in all of this. And because, for instance, computers, I mean, analogies are very important. Computers, Newtonian physics, these are analogies that I think dominate the way people think, even when it's not a literal conversion. Like, for instance, in economics, there's a criticism of economics by George Soros where he criticizes physics envy. And I think people kind of automatically, they transplant these ideas of Newtonian physics and computers into all sorts of places. There are these central analogies of our society. And I think that if we can become more familiar with the geometry of the invisible, we can begin to be able to conceive of and imagine things that through analogies that are not accessible to us through things like computers and Newtonian physics. And some such things are the immortality of the soul, a very important perennial question people have been thinking about for thousands of years, and the soul before birth and death, and then also accountability for our actions, because both of these things, like the immortality of the soul, I think there's the most compelling argument against the immortality of the soul is that you can watch this process of birth. People come into life being unformed, not having any faculties, and you develop those faculties up to a point. You can observe that something is happening in your brain as you're developing these faculties. And then as you get older, the faculties go into decline. You can get to a point where it's hard you lose intelligence, you lose cognitive faculties, and some corresponding process is happening in your brain, and there's a decline, and then it disappears and there's nothing left. But actually, with the continuity principle, how we go from the visible to the invisible with the continuity principle is actually exactly this sort of process where you go from seemingly nothing to something and then back to seemingly nothing. But on both sides of the process, you actually do have something. And so, for instance, you can have a visible circle with a positive radius that shrinks down, and it seems to be disappearing when it becomes a point. But according to the geometry of the invisible, there's actually still circles with negative radius, and I'm doing them visibly, but you can't actually see them. And they still have effects within the visible, which is really, I think, amazing, and an amazing confirmation of the intuition, not just of Rudolf Steiner, but of probably most people throughout most of history, that ancestors, founding heroes, bodhisattvas, spirits of various kinds, spirits of the dead, saints, that they can still have an impact within the visible world, even though they're visible. And I in respect to the next person, I won't say anything about karma, but you can kind of fill in this similar thought process.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the Preston Fellows of Harvard College.